Hi, everyone. We're just going to give a couple minutes before we get started with the webinar. Daniel, last week, a new podcast episode dropped. Would you like to talk a little bit about that episode there?
Yeah, I'm just trying to remember everything about that episode, but it was with Gary Saltapico, and I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing Gary's name correctly. It's quite a long one, but he is a procurement leader at John Lewis, and he was really interesting to talk to. We kind of spoke about the proposition of procurement and whether procurement is a bit out of date, whether it needs a rebrand, what procurement isn't really doing very well, how it's not communicating its value within organizations very well. And a lot of that comes back to like traditional procurement versus like more modern techniques around procurement. So yeah, quite a good listen if anyone's having struggle internally, just trying to figure out how to convey what they bring to the table. Let's say it's probably a good episode to tune into. I've also got one coming up, and I can't recall when it's going live, but with someone called Jen Barkley, and she is a procurement leader for an Australian company that I can't recall off the top of my head, but we also had a very similar conversation, and we went down like an ESG rabbit hole because she also hit up sustainability as part of her procurement role. So yeah, there's quite a bit to it there.
Daniel, I love the part in your podcast where you ask them to explain their role like to a 5-year-old, because some of them take it really literally, and they're like, so you're out shopping with mum and dad and you want to buy XYZ. I love it. It's good though. I've heard procurement roles explained in so many different ways now that I could probably explain it very quickly to a layman. That's my favorite part.
Yeah. I had I believe it was Tom Mills, who I know quite well, and we talked quite a bit, and it just kind of felt like he was like I almost felt like I became his kid for the that few minutes whilst we went through that question. I think we Lucy, I think we're probably good to make a start now.
Yeah, I think attendees are slowing down, so why don't we get started? Hi, everyone. Welcome to our workflow initiation webinar. My name is Lucy Chu. I'm the learning experience lead here at Gatekeeper, and I'm joined by James Ince, our learning experience designer, and Daniel Barnes, our community manager for today. So before we get started, I wanted to do a quick review of our Gatekeeper 3 pillars. And for those of you who have joined us before, you might be familiar with these ones. But we started our Success Hours webinars with Restore Visibility, which focuses on where your data is and how people can view and use it. So within that pillar, we've done 3 previous webinars. And if you're interested in reviewing any of these webinars, they are available in our knowledge base. So currently we're in the Take Controls pillar, where we're focusing on your workflows and your vendor and contract processes. Highly recommend that Workflows 101 webinar that we did last month. So if you haven't checked it out yet, definitely take a look. And our last pillar is going to be our safeguard compliance, which we'll get into after we finish the Take Control side. But this is where we'll dive into more of your vendor compliance and how you can proactively identify and track your risks. So for today's webinar, we're going to be talking about workflow initiation. And in today's fast-paced environment, starting a contract or vendor process really needs to be simple, efficient, and accessible to all your team members. However, we find that's not the case, and we see a lot of organizations still relying on Slack messages, emails, or other means of communication. And really understanding how you can start a workflow and having that dedicated method for starting a request will help ensure that your colleagues will get a clearer picture of all the requests, be able to triage and prioritize your requests, and also provide increased visibility throughout the organization. So our webinar today will cover 2 main areas, first being request-based and second being our triggered workflows.
Yeah, Lucy, thanks for the intro there. And I believe you have the controls over the poll. So as always, with all of these webinar episodes, we like to run a poll at the start just to kind of figure out everyone's level of knowledge around workflows. So yeah, cheers, Lucy, for popping that up. I was just going to add, like, just whilst people are completing the poll, and James, maybe you can give a bit more of a shout out to this, which is your prized knowledge base area within Gatekeeper.
Oh yeah, we'll be showing bits of that later on potentially if we get time in this webinar, for sure. But yeah, depending on your knowledge levels, there's loads of content in the knowledge base, partially about what we're going to be talking about today. So I'll be calling out at certain points of the webinar if you do want to do extra reading or watch extra videos on a particular topic. There'll be elements in the knowledge base that can give you walkthrough guides around the configuration aspect, what it looks like to use some certain things, and especially like best practice tips and tricks and things like that to get the most from the system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And throughout the webinar, please put any questions that you have in our chat or Q&A section just at the bottom of your Zoom there, and we'll be able to answer them throughout and as well as at the end of the webinar.
Yeah, I feel hopefully, if we run on time, James, can you bring your tenant up of Gatekeeper as well as we wait? If we run on time throughout this webinar session, we will have plenty of time for Q&A at the end, and we're trying to answer some along the way if it makes sense to do so. Then, James, awesome, appreciate it. Lucy, we should probably close this
I'm
poll
going
now.
to just end the poll here. I think we have majority of our answers. Let me just share the results here for everybody.
Oh, that's great. Awesome to see people with a little knowledge, some people with a bit more. So it's a mixed house today. So that's great. Yeah, this episode of the Success Hours webinar will be, I think it'd be really useful. Like, I think workflow initiation is probably one of the fundamentals to get right. And maybe I'll just add one more thing, Lucy, before you ask James any questions here, which was, we were originally going to talk about the form, the intake form, and how to craft a really good intake form. We're actually going to push that out to the next session, which will be sometime in August. We will try and confirm the date by the end of this session. I can't recall when we said we would do it, but I think it's mid-August, just because we wanted to do sort of the initiation piece justice here. But yeah, Lucy, over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Daniel. So let's get us started. James, can you tell us about how the employee portal works and how it can be used to start a workflow?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll take a step out of this workflows page here because obviously there's lots of stuff on the screen, but we want to talk about that first element of workflow initiation that you mentioned a couple of minutes ago. So there are those two types of processes that you want to configure in your contract and vendor management platform. There are the request-based ones, and there are the triggered ones, the automated processes that come in later on. And generally you split them into that way for the most part, because you will have processes that facilitate what some people in procurement call pre-signature activities, like new vendor onboardings, internal contract approval and execution requests. And then you have processes later on that, are on the other side of the camp, the post-signature contract and vendor management solutions. Employee portal generally refers to the former of those two. So when you have workflows that facilitate setting up new vendor relationships, getting new contracts requested, what you want to do is be able to give them to your users in a really easy to access and easy to digest way. So this screen I have here, it's called the Submit Requests dashboard, and we'll talk about the term employee portal in a couple of minutes. But this is generally one of the main benefits of the feature, pretty much the main element of the feature itself. So what you get when you have employee portal enabled in your Gatekeeper environment is a dashboard like this for your end users. And what this allows them to do is, especially if we're talking about the control pillar, so we did talk about this in Workflows 101, rather than having your users go to directly to the vendor repository or directly to the contracts repository and just make up their own process, like add things in, set the statuses, set the dates, and add files, you can build an intake form like these ones that we see here, so that you can structure what information do I need from these users, what context and documents and data that do they need to provide, and it's really easily accessible. So the two elements of this submit request dashboard are the availability of those forms. So I can see on the page here, I can touch this NDA request workflow. I can also initiate a vendor onboarding, a contract amendment, or a new contract request. But the other element of this submit request dashboard is providing visibility back to those end users about where their requests are currently sitting. So this is one of the big things that really reduces the amount of admin effort that the managers of a Gatekeeper environment will have to provide. So here, if I have been submitting lots of forms, I can very easily come and see where are they currently sat in the in the Kanban board process, how many steps have they completed and how many have they got left to go? What's their current status and who are they awaiting action by? And that means that I don't have to be pinging like the legal team saying, I submitted this request a week ago, where is it? I can just come here, see a quick overview of all my cards. And if I want to drill a bit deeper as well, I can hit view more to see things like timestamps of when the card's been moving through the particular workflow. So when it landed on a particular phase and when it left it. And I can also see things like messages if conversations will be going on against those cards as well.
James, can you actually show us how somebody could submit a form?
Yeah, sure. So an internal user, once employee portal has been enabled for their environment and the forms have been made available to them in this dashboard, will simply come here and hit request on one of these forms, and it'll pop up an empty form like this with the sections that they need to complete. So for instance, and this is a bit of an edge case workflow, but I want to bring it up because it's a useful scenario to mention, because there might be some people on this call who use workflows. They might even have employee portal, but not be aware of this particular use case. This is actually a request-based workflow for post-signature contract management solutions, but it still falls very neatly into the control pillar, which is the chapter we're obviously in at the moment for this webinar.
It's also a really awkward area, right? Like I know we've been talking about this in that contract amendments. We were discussing this yesterday. Like contract amendments really add a lot of pain onto your workload. So you've got contract reviews, which can be very painful if they're high volumes. You've got non-disclosure agreements, and we're going to cover that briefly later on here. And then contract amendments. So this is a really good way for someone in your business to go through a formal process, and then for whoever's dealing with that renewal, they can triage, prioritize, and process it in a nice way that isn't, say, a request that's coming from email or Slack or just someone at your desk, which is typically how people are dealing with this prior to having a workflow set up in Gatekeeper. So yeah, I'm a big fan of this. James, you're right now, just say with this particular example of this request, it's pulled the contract record and all of the metadata immediately through onto the form because you selected the contract you wish to amend, right?
Yeah, so in the initial section, I was giving context about the change I want to make to this contract, whether or not it's a simple metadata update. Maybe I want to terminate it because the service has run its course, or maybe I want to early renew, something like that. But also then once I've given that context so that users later in the workflow know what they need to do and know what changes I've requested, I can then come to this section, exactly like you said, choose the name of the contract that I want something to happen to. And because the way that this workflow is configured, Gatekeeper will pull all the metadata in, so I can actually upload my amendments that I want to make to it right to this form as well. So users later on in the process, they'll be able to see what are the current values, what are the new values that James has put in based on the amendments that have gone on, and then they'll be able to do any of their other activities and also commit those changes back to the database once they've gone through an appropriate process. So talking about that control pillar, it means that your end users will be able to request updates to your Gatekeeper repository, but they can't just go in and make them willy-nilly, which, is an important thing for a lot of people, I assume, on this call, who might have put a lot of work into their repository, making sure it is up to date and accurate. You don't want anyone to be able to go in and change that. But this allows you to let people request that, basically.
And this is, I was just going to say, James, like, this is fundamentally how any of these workflows that are set up here is that someone will put in some information for someone further down the process, whether it's a vendor onboarding, and you'll normally give some insight into why you're onboarding that vendor. Contract request and normally a bit of information about that contract. And that will just help, whether it's the reviewer of the contract, the reviewer of the due diligence of the vendor, it will give them those insights. And then as we get on to like more features of workflows, that can also help guide which due diligence is pushed out and other things when we look at the conditional logic and bits there. But let's keep it simple before we go down a rabbit hole there.
You're right, but structuring it like that up front and getting all the necessary information from your end users avoids that problem. I think, Lucy, you mentioned it, of where someone might just send a Slack message to a contract manager saying, I need this new contract, can you spin it up? And then there might end up being lots of back and forth, like, what are the terms? Is the vendor okay using our paper? All that sort of stuff. You can build that into the form so that hopefully when they submit their new vendor request, new contract request, contract amendment, you've got all the context you need, and the rest of the process just runs a lot smoother. Yeah. I did promise one thing just before we move on, because I'm aware that I've mentioned the terminology of employee portal before, because you asked to see the module, Lucy. So employee portal is called such, not necessarily because of this dashboard here, but because it also comes with another profile type that you can set up for your end users in Gatekeeper. So if I just change my view here to a different user that I'm logged in as called Ethan Employee, you'll see when you get employee portal, all of your internal users will get that submit requests dashboard. So the people who can see the repository, who can see vendors and contracts, will also be able to fire off those requests. But from time to time, you might want to set up users in your Gatekeeper environment who have a much more restricted view. They aren't browsing all of the files and repositories and so on. All they want to be able to do is fire off requests like that. So you can add a user of type employee portal only access. And when they log in, as you can see here, they barely got anything. All they can do really is see what forms do I have available, what ones have I submitted in the past, and request assistance basically if they have any other queries apart from that. So that's why it's called employee portal, because you get this separate login type and separate user account. But, and this is just my opinion, I think it's the better benefit is having all of your internal users, even the ones that can access the full version of Gatekeeper, have their version of employee portal running in this dashboard here.
Perfect. Thanks, James. So for anybody who's not using the employee portal, let's say, how can they start a workflow when somebody has a request?
Sure. So in those sorts of scenarios, what our clients will generally do is they'll sort of create their own, you might call it a dashboard in maybe like a Confluence page or Tetra or whatever our clients are using. So that what those clients without employee portal can do is, I'm just going to jump under the hood to show you how they can obtain this. They will, once they've configured their workflow and they've built their contract or vendor request form, under the form access tab for that workflow, Gatekeeper will be able to generate a unique URL like this one. And it's a public form. So basically what that means is anyone who has access to this link can open it up. And like you'll see on my page here, it will give them a similar form to the employee portal version, but it just means that they'll have to enter their email address here that will link to their Gatekeeper account, hopefully, so they can be retroactively assigned as like contract owners and so on. And it just means that they don't get that same dashboard level of tracking. If they wanted to find their request forms later on, they'd have to navigate to the Kanban board to seek those out, or hopefully rely on things like automated CC notification emails and like FYI updates and things like that. But this is the public form version, so you can generate URLs like this and store these somewhere easily accessible to your users.
Yeah, James, those FYI or those updates via email, like they're just a good practice to get into anyway. Not necessarily bombarding people's mailboxes with those, because you can definitely overdo it on the notifications. But even for people with employee portal switched on, just sometimes notifying them, say maybe just within Gatekeeper or just a message at a very important stage, like, oh, your contract's been signed. Really
exactly.
useful.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be every single phase of the workflow where you're like, it's now at step 4 out of 5, 5 out of 5. You can just be like, once it's done, you can say the contract you requested, it's been signed and executed. Thanks for participating. But yeah, it's definitely courteous, isn't it? Especially if a lot of the people on this call might be workflow managers and they might see everything and completely understand the process, but end users might not have been there whilst it was being built. They might not understand what's going on behind the scenes. So it's a nice gesture to be letting them know this is what's happening and this is what's going to happen in future, things like that.
Yeah, and I think we're going to try and show a little bit more of that off next month, right? When we're doing the intake form, we're going to try and fit that in if we can and just give it a little bit more time and attention.
Yeah, we'll talk about the proper user experience there, but yeah, today I guess we're focusing more on the what's technically possible rather than the improving the experience for end users.
Yeah.
So James, Gatekeeper also has touchless links. Could you explain the differences between the public forms versus the touchless links and how they differ to start a workflow?
Sure. And they are fairly similar in the fact that they will, when you create a touchless form workflow, you'll have a URL like the one we just saw for that internal contract request generated to start the workflow. The design of these, and I think we touched on it very, very briefly in the last webinar because we had some questions about them, is orientated around taking away some of that manual effort. So I know we did talk about having a good form up front to get all the context and data you need to make the rest of the process run smoother. What these workflows really help with, though, is getting contracts and vendors into the system with very little manual effort. So the design of this particular workflow, following the link like this, is that you would send this to a vendor and it will allow them to basically preview your set of contracting terms and immediately get it get one of those contracts generated for that vendor and signed, so that by the end of this workflow, which hopefully should be a very quick end-to-end execution time, you will then be able to be working with that vendor and gatekeeper for more complex agreements like your master services agreement and all, with all the bells and whistles. But this is really just streamlining that initial setup. So what you have on this page, if a vendor user would be opening a touchless form link like this, they'd be able to preview an example of, and this is Gatekeeper Synergy Technology Limited's NDA. They'd be able to preview this and then log their decision around whether they're happy to get this signed, they've viewed it and they're fine, or they want to propose changes. And Daniel's gonna Daniel's gonna jump in if I don't bring this up. I just want to highlight, you can remove this choice from your touchless forms. If there's a client, if there's an attendee on this call who likes the idea of this, but is looking at this button like, oh, that's making me cringe, you can remove this. And I'll be honest, of the clients I've configured this for in the past, most of them have, because Daniel, you're of this opinion, aren't you, that an NDA should be very simple. If you give the option to all your vendors to propose changes, they probably will, which will lead to a lot more effort than should be in place for such a simple agreement.
I think, like we were talking about this yesterday, and I always almost like for some of these agreements, when you're in, say, a legal team, a contract management team, even procurement, you just want to go with like brute force with non-disclosure agreements. They're so straightforward. It's normally just to give a bit of assurances. A lot of people are using standardized agreements now that you can't change anyway, and that button can at times just ask for people to make changes, even if they don't want to. They'll be compelled to do so. That's kind of where we get to when we're looking at contract. So I'm a big fan of removing this. And James, you did touch on the like I think there's a really good use case for using this for like your master services agreements, or just like your more like generic terms that govern the relationships. I think this could be a really good way to get that process started way faster than say a traditional sort of the intake method that we've got with contract reviews. Like there's perks to both, but I'm a big fan of this. So I'd be interested to hear if people are using this out and seeing how they're getting on.
Yeah, and I am sorry, I didn't add that just to trigger you. It's just I like configuring everything.
I always get triggered
about the art of the possible, so I just added it there. But you can remove that. But basically, how this works is once those vendor users log their decision, and like I said, you can take that decision away, so they have to say, "Fine, I'm okay to sign this." Then they will then be able to enter their email address here. So I could enter an email address of a well-known CEO. He's in the news a lot these days. And when that user will hit find, Gatekeeper will be able to take their email address and find out from publicly available information who is that person. So this will be their user record once they're added to the system, and who's that organization that is going to be added as a vendor record. And it also gives them a chance, as we can see here, to change some of that.
Just to confirm, this is the vendor completing this. So this is them fact checking their own information at this point, as opposed to a procurement manager checking it at this point. This puts it fundamentally on the vendor, which is great.
Yeah, exactly. So your end users or your internal, vendor management or contract management teams aren't having to spend time compiling this data. The vendor can be adding it themselves and checking it over before it makes its way into your repository. So it's a time save on both fronts. The fact that it builds it for them, and it's the vendor user doing it. So it's a double win there. And then when they hit submit, Gatekeeper will build their user, their vendor, and a version of that NDA, but with Tesla ink in it instead of the dummy vendor record we saw a second ago. One thing I want to call out, because some eagle-eyed viewers might have seen this when we were in the submit request dashboard, is a touchless NDA form in something called My Touchless Forms in the submit request dashboard. So one thing, and you just highlighted this, Daniel, is that this, because it's started by vendors, there's an element that might creep in of who's responsible for this vendor relationship once it becomes a record and once the NDA is created and so on. What you can give to your users, and it becomes so much easier for those users to access this if you have employee portal like this, you can create a customized link that, in this case, James Ince can access from his dashboard. And when he copies this and follows this link, or gives this to the vendor and they follow the link, it will be the case that Gatekeeper sort of behind the scenes is noting, because Elon or whoever accesses this link in future has used the link James Ince sent him, when that record makes it to the repository later on, Gatekeeper can capture James Ince must be the internal vendor manager or the internal NDA owner or responsible for any of those records that make it into your repository. So personalized links add that extra element of audit trails as well as responsibility for records in your repository later on as well.
James, could you, I think we're good on time. So could you could you set one up for me just on this?
Yeah.
Like they
I
take
think
seconds to
I
do,
might have
right?
created one for you already. It's so easy to do.
Oh, okay.
And it doesn't need employee portal. So it's worth mentioning whilst we're doing this. Once you've created your touchless workflow like this, and I'll call out the knowledge base whilst we're here, we have a walkthrough guide on how to build this exact workflow, start to end, and it's really not that difficult to do. But once you have a workflow like this and you go to the form access tab to access that link we saw earlier, workflow admins will have this option here to say manage personal links. And what you can do is I've set up some for
yeah, I can see mine.
Add. Right, if you logged in.
Yeah,
right,
I can see it on my employee
you can go
portal.
add, and you can either start typing individual people's names if you want to give it to a specific user. Oh, Ian's not in our system. Or you can just select all, and Gatekeeper will choose every user in your environment. And then when you hit save, there we go. We've got all these custom links. But talking to the public form, the non-employee portal versus employee portal version, if your users don't have that submit request dashboard to access these, this is where you will access them, and you'll have to give them to your end users. So for instance, if I wanted to give Lucy hers, I'd copy this link. Or if I wanted to give Patrick his, I'd copy this link and give it to him. And this is where you can create them and get the links as well.
Appreciate it, James. Thanks for showing that off. I think it's probably like an underused feature of Gatekeeper, and one that can bring immense benefits very quickly, because especially just using it for NDAs, I think is incredible. It just will speed things up massively.
Mm-hmm. Before we jump into the triggered workflow side of things, we just have a question here from Christina. If we need to create a new workflow, a very simple one designed just to manage the signature of corporate documents, is this form a place where you address the question of how concretely speaking your clients can create a new workflow?
Sorry, Daniel.
No, I was just going to say, James, go.
I was going to say, well, I don't know if we're going to necessarily go into building a workflow today. We'll be talking about, we'll certainly be showing some config but focused on how workflows can begin. But we won't be building out a Kanban board with all of the phases necessarily today. I mean, I've been showing some of the under the hood config for basically some workflows that I've already built to show you what the end result should be once you're ready to use it. But it'll be subsequent workflows where we go into building the different elements of them. Like Daniel said, the next one we do in August, we'll talk about how to build an intake form and improve the user experience for those requesting users. But that specific use case might take a few webinars before we get there. But there's definitely knowledge-based content for it.
And we'll have your CSM reach out, Christina.
Yeah, I was just going to add like two things there. One, contract review, best practice workflow. If it is contracts, I'm not sure. It's maybe something different. And I'm pretty sure this is correct, James. This is where my knowledge sometimes gets tested, because I haven't used this feature for a while in Gatekeeper. But I recall that you can start an e-sign process from a PDF document in the vendor record area.
Yes.
So from the files area, if you do just need to, maybe I don't know what this document is, but maybe you have it's not a contractual document. It's maybe a health and safety document or something like that. And you've got it assigned in your files. You can go in. Oh, James, you're demonstrating it perfectly.
Well,
I think
the only file I've got in this vendor record is their credit report, but it's probably
we can butcher it for this.
It will work. We can sign a credit report if we want to, but you're exactly right that technically you can, like, it's a very good practice to build e-sign into especially a contract management workflow, because that should normally be one of the latter steps of getting a contract executed, signing it. And you can build Gatekeeper e-sign or a DocuSign integration into the workflow to make sure that is facilitated as one of those final steps. But as long as you have a PDF record attached to either a vendor or a contract metadata record in your repository, e-sign admins can just come straight there and hit start e-sign, choose the e-sign solution. And I've only got Gatekeeper e-sign enabled in this environment, but if you have both Gatekeeper and DocuSign, you can select between the two and then go straight into the e-sign configuration screen there. So depending on the nature of this process that Christina's raised, a workflow might do it, but it also could be the case that if they just have ad hoc documents to sign, you can also do it directly from the repository if you need to.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure, and it's going. My memory's being challenged a little bit here, but I've done this for like the ad hoc documents that they're not contracts. You just kind of want some commitment on both sides to say, yeah, we did this thing. Whether it's like an appraisal, like a vendor check, like a review, quarterly review, yearly review. It's a really good way to do it. So yeah,
yeah, for sure.
Perfect. Sorry, I see a raised hand, Alex. Alex, if you don't mind just putting your question there, either in the chat or in the Q&A section, and we'll be able to get to that in a moment there. Good to move on to the next section, Daniel, James?
Yeah, all
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. Perfect. So second portion, can we talk more about how to automate the start of a workflow rather than looking at a request-based workflow initiation?
Yeah, for sure. So, and this was the bit that you called out earlier, you used the term triggered workflows. So I guess it's good for us to explain that term, because if there are some people here that don't have that knowledge of configuring Gatekeeper workflows, they might not know what it means. So it, like I said earlier, mainly pertains to those post-signature contract management, contract and vendor management processes that hopefully, if you can standardize, you can automate them as well. So what you can do with a particular workflow is, rather than give it to your users in the form of like a request form, you can create a set of rules called a trigger that Gatekeeper will check for you and automate the initiation of the workflow for you as well. And the easiest scenario to explain this for is for a contract renewal review. So for instance, if you have your end dates and your termination notice period dates captured in your repository, you may well, like we've talked about in previous webinars, use dashboards to be checking what's the sort of cash flow going to be coming up, you know, what sort of renewals are we going to have to be assessing in future. But what you'll definitely want to do is automate that review process. So it's not the case that someone's having to check spreadsheets and dashboards to manually remember, oh, this contract's coming up to a key termination period. So for this particular workflow, I have gone and configured some triggers, and we'll see there's a few for this workflow, but I'll dive into one just to take you under the hood and show you what they look like. I've created some rules here to say that for all of my contracts that are either pipeline or live, so they might still be going through a sort of process or might not have had their status flipped, or those that are active, when the end date of the contract is 90 days from today, so 90 days from today, it's like October time, so around 26th of October, a contract, Gatekeeper will find that contract in the repository, pull it onto the workflow for us, creating one of those cards, filling out the form with the existing contract metadata, and notifying a key stakeholder, such as probably the contract owner, you know, the internal business owner of a record. That's typical for a renewal workflow, but you could also be notifying the contract or vendor management team, so they've got a heads up about a certain renewal approaching. And so if I click into this workflow here, we'll see there are a few cards that have triggered on here. And if I go into the history of these, we'll be able to see that a day ago, for instance, this card, the notice period date was approaching, so it was triggered onto the workflow. And as a result, there's a card that's been created here. It's been fleshed out with the contract metadata from the repository, and Josh will have been notified as the contract owner that he has a review to perform.
This is this for me is one of the easiest workflows to set up and one of the most valuable ones, right? Because I'm still talking to people every day who tell me that they keep missing auto renewals, like they're not picking up on them, like their vendors don't want to get rid of them, the contract, they're not serving notice, and they're getting punished when they just let them lapse, mainly because I'm still talking to people who are using tracker documents, right? Like Excel documents and things like that. But if you don't have this workflow set up currently in Gatekeeper, it's probably a really easy one to do, especially with the best practice workflows. I think, James, you and I have probably set one up in minutes, just following the knowledge base guide. And I know that's a little bit of cheating on your part because you built it, but I've been able to follow pretty much every single one and get them set up in minutes. It's just such an easy one to do.
Mentioning that tracker document as well is key, because not only does it save you that time of someone having to be checking a document maybe on a weekly or a monthly or even a daily basis, there's a risk element to it as well, that humans are fallible, right? Like that person checking the tracker might take annual leave, or they might miss a renewal that's coming up. And if you aren't assessing your renewing contracts until like maybe they auto renew and you've got to spend for another term, or you're in a really poor negotiating position because the contract has already auto renewed, you're in a worse standing. Whereas if you set these rules, which, you know, sometimes I just call them set them and forget them rules, because you can create this and just be like, good, Gatekeeper is going to notify me when an end date or a notice period date is approaching, and I don't have to worry about being on top of my contract repository all the time. As long as the data there is fine, and hopefully if you have good request form based workflows, it is, then the post-signature contract and vendor management processes are just going to run themselves, basically.
Cool. James, just quickly, the triggered workflows. the lightning bolt, right? That signifies the triggered one, just as a visual, just in case anyone's not picked up on that. It's just, that's how you can tell the difference there very quickly.
Exactly, yeah. Some people might have spotted that the submit request dashboard only had, I think, 3 or maybe 4 available forms, whereas on this page I clearly have a lot more. These green lightning bolts, exactly that. It means they've got triggered rules set up for them, and the green basically means Gatekeeper is checking those triggers on a regular basis.
Yeah, and these don't appear on that employee portal view that you showed, because someone doesn't need to actually say, oh, I need you to do this. It just does it based on the rules that we've set up.
Exactly. So yeah, so on over here we've got a date-based one, which is that contract renewal review approaching. You've mentioned this other one on a previous workflow, haven't you? So on the vendor management side, if you have documents that you need to keep up to date as well for compliance reasons, like SOC audits, ISO certificates, and so on, you can do the exact same thing. You can set up a trigger to say, if this document is expiring, notify someone that it needs replacing, and that could be the vendor themselves to say, come into Gatekeeper and give us a new version, or it could be an internal stakeholder, depending on what modules you have, how you currently run that process as an organization.
Yeah, and just a quick tip on that workflow: if you are asking for vendor documentation, just make sure you choose the option of uploading a document with an expiry date as well, because it means that you don't have to manually then go in and put the date in yourself. So it's a really good way to do that. James, could you well, I'm just going to check first. Do you want to go into Market IQ next, or do you want to show your very special one? I think you're perhaps saving to the end here.
No, yeah, but let's talk about Market IQ first, because it's easier usually to talk about. So now that we've gone into the second type of workflow initiation, which is those triggered workflows, there's actually a second type of trigger to discuss. So the scenario that there was a stimulus for this workflow initiating, and the same with this one, is basically the passage of time. You set up a rule and you set up your contracts and vendors, and when the dates in those vendor or contract records approaches the particular trigger criteria, Gatekeeper starts the process. There is another type of trigger in Gatekeeper that's not necessarily date-based, but value-based, like metadata. And it's a really cool scenario to explain it for this workflow, the Market IQ escalation one, because it also calls out one of our other really cool modules that will probably come into more detail on in the compliance pillar, because it's definitely a really useful risk monitoring tool. Basically, what you can do is you can set up a trigger, and I'll open up one of these to be talking about what's under the hood, that looks at metadata values that are changing. So basically, I have 2 trigger conditions for this workflow, this Market IQ, which is a risk tool in Gatekeeper.
James, could you
vendors?
And I know we've just made this new tenant very quickly in the last week or so. Do you have any vendors that have a Market IQ finance check in?
Yeah.
Some people, I'm just conscious, some people might not be aware of what this is. Yeah, great. It just helped give it a little bit of context. Yeah, as you can see on screen here, we've got a rating, a credit rating score, which is a B grade. We've got some other insights, right? The historical performance of that vendor. I'm not sure if we're putting too much info Atlassian on this one. We've got a rating in terms of the credit rating description, and we actually have the full credit report available as a master document, the PDF here. And I think just a little bit lower down, we've got just a little bit around the location, right? Yeah, cool.
Yeah, some of the information.
Just so everyone can kind of see what we're talking about. And the workflow that we're just going into is, fundamentally, if we see a change in the financial health of one of our vendors, it's going to trigger a workflow action for us. So James, I'll hand that back over to you now. I just thought the context there would be useful.
Yeah, that's useful. Thanks for calling it out, because I would have just skipped straight over that and assumed everyone knew what I was talking about. So the triggers that we have here pertain to that data tab we just looked at against Atlassian, the vendor. So Gatekeeper will be checking all the vendors in the repository, and basically this trigger criteria means that if Gatekeeper detects a drop in one of those scores, and just to give a bit extra context, that data that we saw in that tab is being pulled in on a live feed from our credit safe integration. So once you have a vendor connected to Market IQ Financial, every time something changes in credit safe, Gatekeeper will automatically be fed that data. And if Gatekeeper detects that the credit safe says the score has dropped, i.e. it's trending down, and you can also give criteria to say where it's dropped to, this is when the workflow will trigger. So in this case, we've configured a set of triggers to say, if Gatekeeper detects a drop and it drops into a band of D or E, which are those 2 very low scores, we decide some sort of mitigating or some sort of review or mitigating action needs to take place. So we will trigger a workflow in that scenario. But this is just an example. You can be more stringent with your vendors, or you can be more lax. So I just thought D and E was like a typical quite a risky vendor relationship at that point.
We spoke about this yesterday, right? Like this is so proportionate, and it really depends on your business's risk profile in the first place. So some businesses will have a complete different risk profile, even if they're similar size in the same industry, right? So it effectively lets you tailor it to however you want to go about your vendor's financial health. And I know, like, and it's not just procurement teams that are going to nerd out about this, it's your finance team. So it's a really good opportunity to work finance and just really get under the hood of like what your challenges are, like where you're prepared to go. Yeah, it's just it's a good collaboration opportunity here. But yeah, you've got like you said, there's a lot of different options there. Some people will just want the highest rated ones.
Yeah, exactly. And you might have different thresholds depending on the criticality of the relationship. Like if it's a very key partner, critical to business operations, you might say, well, I only want A's and B's. If it goes below that, then I need to take some action. Everyone else can be a D and E at that point. So you can set up, just like we saw on the renewal workflow, you can set up multiple triggers to have different scenarios start the process basically. I was just thinking about that point a little bit last night. Like if say I have a single source provider, or even a sole source provider, maybe a sole source, like I fundamentally have one supplier that's so important to me, and if they go, we're kind of screwed. I'm really going to want to pay extra attention to those. So I may be watching sort of any minor movements on their credit. Whereas like if I've got a transactional supplier, one that I know I've got a dozen other suppliers I could go out to, I'm probably going to be a little bit more chilled out. I'll still want to monitor it, but the fact is it's going to be less onerous for us if we do need to jump ship with those. So maybe we don't need to have A and B scores only with those ones. Yeah, exactly. And I guess just to call out that I was only showing Market IQ, the financial monitoring, but we also have a cybersecurity risk monitoring side as well. So you could have a similar workflow like this where you're monitoring for like InfoSec risk criteria. So it's not just finance and procurement teams. It might be like your InfoSec officers and data protection teams that also could leverage this sort of workflow, but rather than looking at credit ratings, they can look at the risk data coming from security integration with security scorecard. But have the exact same process and exact same triggers up.
Can you just show this?
Yeah, just what the data tab.
The cyber. Yeah. I'm very aware. Like this is more of a newer feature of Market IQ, and some people will not be too aware of it just yet.
So it's a similar screen you get. You don't get a credit report because not necessarily is a credit report for cybersecurity, but you get a similar sort of grading and historical rating of this vendor. So you see that over time, how reliable are they from an InfoSec standpoint? And if you do need to dig a bit deeper, so there's the element of you can use this data when you have Market IQ Cyber to trigger those monitoring workflows. But if something severe happens, you do need to dig deeper. There's links in here, and same in Market IQ Financial, in fact, to follow that through to the host source to dive a bit deeper into what might have caused a drop in a particular score.
Yeah, there's certain different weightings, and I don't propose we go over those. We've got some articles on the website. It's in the knowledge base. We've got a whole bunch of information, and we don't want to get that wrong for you here. But there is there's a formula that security scorecard follows in terms of the changes there. But it's really a good feature, right? And James, whilst we're here, I doubt you've got anything on IQ Screen, Market IQ Screen there. But just to add, you don't have anything yet. Yes. This is where we'll be looking at like PEP sanctions, things like that as well. So you can track the people and the ownership structures of your vendors. So it's just to give the context here. I don't want to talk in abstracts too often. But we can do this with both Market IQ Finance and Market IQ Cyber. Downward trend, start a risk mitigation process. Really useful, especially given that this is happening more and more in our supply chains. So it's a good overview there, James. Appreciate it. James, I'm very cognizant of time, but I know that you really want to show a slightly different method of triggering a workflow. So I'll hand that over to you now.
I do, and I hope I've got all this ready to like explain in clear enough terms without skipping.
Can we caveat?
Entirely.
We're just going to caveat this one. We weren't sure if we were going to get time to show it off. We're not going to necessarily show the config off because there's a bit more config to get this up and running. And it's a little bit, I hate to use the word complex. It's a little bit more complex to get it up and running. It's easy to follow, and I'll hand it over to James. So we're just going to show you kind of like the end result of how this works.
Sure. So what I'm about to show is how you can combine request-based workflows like those form-based ones we saw in Employee Portal with triggered workflows to add some sophistication to how you do things. And Daniel, you've had this come up on one of your podcast episodes recently around how
Agile procurement, right?
Agile procurement,
Agile
exactly,
methodology.
like running things in tandem because it saves time, and that the risk of needing to backtrack is so low that the time you save by running multiple threads is always
Well, James,
basically.
We
I know.
set up Gatekeeper. We had this vision at some point. We didn't get to it though. Like, life gets in the way, right? But fundamentally, I wanted to trigger from a vendor onboarding workflow, a contract review workflow, and just have it do it so that I and my team didn't have to worry about doing anything manually there.
Exactly. So in this case that I'm about to show, this is a very short, simple vendor onboarding workflow where there's like a request and approval, onboarding form, and a few other reviews. What you might want to do if you have a few different tasks that form part of your vendor onboarding workflow, maybe you need to get an NDA signed because you want that confidentiality and you want that upfront relationship and guarantee with your new partner, and maybe you want to perform separate reviews like modern slavery, ESG, but you don't want them to form sequential processes, because let's say an NDA takes a week, an ESG assessment takes a few days, the regular onboarding form where we talk about risk and other compliance things takes an extra few days. Running those end to end as part of a big workflow could mean that it takes like a month or longer.
A long time.
Yeah, and your end users will not like that, and you might from time to time run into people who try and find ways around things because they don't like the long lead time. So what I have here is a new partner that someone has requested. It was me who has requested it, actually. And what's about to happen is Gatekeeper is going to create that partner and set some fields, a bit like how Market IQ automatically sets fields, that are going to fire off other processes in tandem via triggered workflows whilst this one carries on. So what I'm going to do here is approve this vendor to say that we're happy to go forward and onboard them. And there we are. So at this point, Gatekeeper should have emailed Ingrid, IT partner, who will be the representative from that vendor. She can now complete their main onboarding form. But if I navigate back to the workflows page, what we'll see is we want an NDA in place with this vendor. So this NDA workflow has triggered, and you'll see Gatekeeper has created, if I click into this card, a PDF NDA record. And if I click into it, hopefully it will say IT Partner Demo Co. That's their legal name. And that's now out with Ingrid and also me to sign because I'm the one that requested the relationship. And at the same time, and this is our best practice template, so I'm going to call out the knowledge base again in a second. At the same time, Gatekeeper has kicked off a standalone ESG due diligence assessment. So that will be available to any vendor user from IT Demo Partner, can't remember the name of them, to complete. So basically there's 3 processes there that can be kicked off in tandem. So you can multi-thread your setup or your ongoing management of your vendors and contracts to save time to make things more agile. But yeah, James, like Daniel, sorry.
No, I was just going to add, like, you made a good point earlier on in that from the vendor's perspective, it's not normally one person completing out these vendor onboarding, right? They might have someone from their risk team, their infosec team, sales team, all over the place. And if we are doing it sequential, they kind of have to pull someone in at the right time. Yep. But we can have all these multiple different stakeholders on the part of the vendor come in and just go at it, and we can get this done way faster. I'm a big fan of this way of working. I've always done contract reviews alongside vendor onboarding. The risks normally they don't. It's rare that something goes so wrong that you don't work with the vendor if you've done your checks up front. So exactly, I'm a big fan of this. So yeah, it's great to see this.
Yeah, but I won't go into the config for this, like you said, because it's quite involved. There's a bit that you've got to do, but I'll call out the knowledge base that we do have an article on this specific use case. It's called Parallel Workflows 2. So you can just search for that within Gatekeeper, find the article there, and it has walkthrough videos of how to configure it, how it looks, pretty much what we've just seen, and some suggested use cases for it. So I just actually ran 3 parallel workflows there because I had vendor onboarding and ESG and NDAs, but you could have more, you could have less, depending on how you want to leverage this.
Yeah, we can, we send an email out normally about a week after with the recording of this webinar. We can include a link to that specific knowledge base there as well. And of course, your CSM, your customer success manager, is more than happy to help you out with this. I just add, James, I think I may be losing my mind a little bit, but I also think we suggested that we will also send out a touchless contract link. I can't recall if we've mentioned it in this session,
We didn't,
but we are
but we
going to.
should. Yeah.
We're going to send one of those out next week as well as part of that email, so that you can almost pretend to be a vendor and you'll complete it. I'll come into, I think this instance, we'll have it set up just to kind of take you through that process, so you can almost imagine what it's like for your vendors, and maybe just test if it's something that you would like to include in your setup.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we will send one of those out so they can do exactly that. That'll be in that follow-up email for sure.
Awesome. James, is that everything we were going to cover? Is there anything else that's just come to mind as we've been going through that you would like to add? Otherwise, we can certainly open up for Q&A otherwise.
Nothing else I don't necessarily want to show. I guess I'll call out the knowledge base again, that if you do have a public form workflow or are considering building one because you might not have employee portal yet, you can very easily go to our knowledge base, and there's a walkthrough guide of how to set them up and improve the user experience for them there. For sure. And
the search bar there as well is a relatively new update, right? Before there was just a button that you would click and then you would go into the knowledge base and then have to search there. This is a little bit more forthcoming, so you can just search from within Gatekeeper, be taken to the correct area. James, could you I just, whilst we've got people here, can you go back onto that view on the, I just want to show people the user voice area so that people can raise requests. Just like, so we have something called the ideas forum, right? And I'm sure that many of you that are watching this right now have used this, but fundamentally, if there's any suggestions you have as to how Gatekeeper can be better, if you want a new feature, if you want to just do anything that we can't do right now in Gatekeeper, come in here and raise a request. I would just add, just double check to see if anyone else has already raised a request or a similar request, because you can effectively upvote it. And we, our product team, work on these every single month. We are bringing out new features based on what the community is after. And it's a really cool way to get whatever you want. It's been really interesting since leaving being a practitioner, coming in-house in Gatekeeper and seeing some of the requests I voted on become a reality. So it's been kind of cool to see.
We just got custom tabs out last month. But
that was one of my first asks. So I'm a big fan of that. James, just actually, do we have custom tabs on show in this one, or is it something we can show next week, just in the next month's session? I don't know if you've set any up in this 10.
I can show it in my staging environment because that's where it's been available to me for longer. I don't have.
And I'm going to caveat, because just in staging can sometimes be a little bit temperamental, because our product team may be working on this right now. So if anything doesn't work, it's because our product team's working on it behind the scenes, and we've not told them not to work on it. So this is a little bit risky from James here.
So a custom tab to talk to the request that Daniel made back when he was a Gatekeeper user. On this data tab of a vendor, you might have you have your core data sections, like your vendor summary information, key vendor data, like their legal name and registered address. Sometimes you'll be capturing custom data, and we have talked about this in previous webinars back in the restore visibility side. But if you have lots of custom data and you have it for very specific use cases that not necessarily everyone needs to be aware of, what you can do is segment this out. So it's not just sat in the data tab in one long form. You can move it to specific tabs like this one, and I've created one for ESG over here, so that if someone does need to be performing ESG reviews, this isn't very well fleshed out in this environment. If there is ESG data, like you said, let's say you have long ESG assessment forms and lots of information, data and documentation you're capturing, you can segment it out, pull it into a separate tab, so that users who care about this can visit it and perform their own reviews here, and everyone else doesn't have to navigate around it whilst they're looking for the information that they need. Yeah,
it's a big improvement for me in terms of just keeping the data. A good user experience change, this one. We've got some upcoming changes as well, just to improve this feature some more. But James, that was really cool to see. I'll let you jump off of this, especially as we're on staging, and I don't want it to freeze on us or do anything. Just got the sweats going.
Just in the interest of time, Daniel and James was going to jump into a couple questions here, if that's all right.
Of course.
Perfect. first one here, if I initiate a workflow, will I be able to access my card later to make amendments?
That's an interesting question. So like if a user requests a new contract, the to make amendments bit stands out as a no, basically. So when a user requests a card, and there is a setting that I'll show here because workflow admin should be aware of this, that you can make the access a user has to their cards later on a bit more enhanced. So you can enable this setting, card creator view on the access. Basically, whenever someone initiates a workflow, they'll always be able to find their card on the Kanban board. But when you enable this, they'll also be able to click into that card and see, you know, has the form been updated? Has extra data been added and like approvals been provided? And can I also like see some conversations and discussions that have been going on there? So I definitely recommend enabling that so that your end users can get that enhanced visibility of forms they've kicked off. The bit where that question mentioned to make amendments, the reason that is a no is because the way that form editing works in workflows is the only people that can edit a form at a particular point are the ones who own it. So for instance, at this review here, the only person who should be able to edit the form if it's been configured that way is this SAMP user. So the requester of the contract can't go in later and start changing things because that could have upset the flow. Like you don't want someone to be able to request a contract and say, oh, it's 0 value. This can bypass all of the approval processes. And then near the end, right before it's signed, be like, actually it was €1,000,000, but you know, I've changed it retroactively. You don't want that to happen. So there's a really hard lock on who can change things and when, but users can access their cards later, but they won't just be able to change the form data willy-nilly.
And if there is a change that has been made for, you know, a genuine reason, like James, your point there was really good. Like locking down compliance, building a really good audit trail, absolutely need it. But sometimes, you know, as a card is progressing, stuff changes. Maybe the scope has increased, decreased. I know, like there's a million one scenarios there. You can just send a message within the card, and whoever's reviewing it or who's owning it at that point can make a call and update the form accordingly. Also, like the way I used to work this is like a few of us within like our supplier management team, we're effectively admins, right? So we've got the authority to go in and change things if required, right? So there's loads that you can do to get around this without tarnishing the audit trail and getting around something like James said, lowball contract value to get out of a proper contract review process. So yeah, it's a good one for sure.
Yeah.
From Billy over here says a walkthrough of a workflow build out would be very useful to ensure that we're following any best practices. I'm sure a lot of our customers have the same sentiment.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this. I saw this question come in. I know that James, you have created a number of complete end-to-end guides for our best practice workflows that are in the knowledge base. I know that a couple still need to be like just polished off and finalized, but there are some end-to-end on-demand videos that are in the knowledge base articles. James, could you just whilst we're here, just click on add and go to workflow templates. You can just check any one of these. Most of them have, and James, maybe you can correct me as to which ones don't have a video. But we do have a complete end-to-end walkthrough here on demand.
Yeah.
But to Billy's point, though, I think it may be useful to do one just as a webinar session, just to go through some of these features. I know we're going to do intake form next time. At least we've got that planned. We'll have a chat about whether the next one we can try and do that, or whether it's going to be like the third or fourth one in the series. But I think we'll definitely come to it at some point, and we'll probably use these best practice workflows as the starting point because it just shortcuts it so much. Like James and I have made workflows from scratch, and depending on like how big or complex they are, they can take a little while. But we much prefer just using the best practice workflows as the foundation now.
Yeah, because they get you over that hurdle. Sorry, Lucy. Oh, sorry, I realized there's a poll.
Oh, no worries. I was just going to say, just on that point there, we have a poll just to see what
that's a good one.
other features or topics that everybody would like to see. So James, please continue as everybody's just filling out this response here.
This is actually super relevant, but because this brings up one of the things that is pertinent to the question around walking through a workflow build, that there's so many moving parts, and so much underlying knowledge that you'd probably need before you can just start building a workflow directly in Gatekeeper, that it would be good for us, to go through some of these different topics we've got in the poll, but also the reason for these best practice templates is that generally, once you generate them, they're only a few steps from being ready to go. And on all of these knowledge base articles, there'll be a diagram of those underlying building blocks, like the phases and the actions that are going to be taking place at each point. And below that, there'll be configuration steps to say, now that you've got the template with all of the main config done, here are the final steps that you need to get the workflow over the line and ready to use. But yeah, it's a good suggestion from you there, Daniel, that you could try building a few of these so that you can get your head around, like, what does the workflow need to get cards from one end to the other with the resultant metadata and documents in the repository that should be part of a successful workflow.
Yeah, I would just add that, like, when we were building out these best practice workflows, like, we've put a lot of knowledge and like expertise from procurement, contract management, legal, things we've seen with our customers, stuff we already have inherently as a business, our knowledge to really try and figure out the best starting point for almost anyone so that they can just make those tweaks to make it fit their business. So yeah, they're super useful. Awesome to
exactly
see
that,
yeah, just looking here, like, people want to see the best practice workflows, approvals, workflow actions, phase ownerships. I think we can probably tie all of those into just showcasing it by editing and configuring a best practice workflow. I did just see, I'm appreciative that we're going slightly over here. I just saw one question come in around custom tabs. James, can you see that question in the webinar chat? And do you have any data to show how to do this? It may be a hard one because we haven't built the tenant up with lots of custom data yet to show how to move it into a custom tab. So it might be that we just send a
yeah, this is one of the key features of custom tabs that we were adamant of getting in. So I do have some custom data sections we can do this for. So the question is basically, we already have custom data for our supplier records and it's already been populated. So this is probably going to be very common for Gatekeeper clients, that they've been using custom data for a long time and custom tabs are brand new. So can we migrate all of these custom data sections we've got away from the core data tab, like we saw in that staging environment, to a custom tab? And the answer is yes, it's really easy to do. We've made it as simple as possible. So the first step you have to take, and I'll do it for this GDPR and InfoSec one over here, and I'll do it for a contract record, but it's worth noting you can add custom tabs to contracts or vendors. Vendors are more likely that ESG case, but you can do it for contracts as well. So we've got a custom data section for GDPR over here, but what I'm going to do is add a custom tab, and I'll call it pretty much the same thing. I'll call it InfoSec, and I'll say this is a contract related custom tab, and then hit save. And this could be where, if I was building a fresh Gatekeeper environment, I could start building out my metadata. But in this exact scenario, let's say we've had this Gatekeeper environment in a while. This existing metadata group, I can then navigate alongside it, hit move, and then say, I want to dump this into that InfoSec tab that I've just created. And you'll see it vanishes from this page. But if I go over to this custom tab in InfoSec, we'll see there's that custom group, GDPR and InfoSec. And if I go to a contract record and open it up, on the data screen, there is no GDPR and InfoSec stuff here, but there's a tab up there, InfoSec, that has that section that we added in earlier. This is empty for this contract in particular, but that's exactly how you do it. You create the tab and then hit move next to the group that you've got. Really easy to do.
And James, your point was, if we are maybe we don't have all of that history of custom data, maybe we're a newer Gatekeeper customer, we would just start building the custom data straight into the custom tab, as opposed to how we've always done it, which is on the custom data tab here.
Yeah,
I'm aware I'm saying tab a lot here. So just to really clarify, we'd go into custom tabs in config and we'd build out the custom data here, as opposed to custom data tab as traditionally we would do.
Exactly. So for instance, I could be in this custom tab, InfoSec, and I can add a new group here called, I don't know, GDP. There was already a group called GDPR, but I'm pulling a blank memory-wise.
Sorry.
But you could add a new group and then start building out fields here in the exact same way that you might have done it previously. But yeah, if you had already built out custom groups like we have in this environment, you can move them just as easily.
Yeah, and just to like tie this back to the initiation piece. And I know we didn't cover forms, but you may have specific form data that you really just want to section off, which might be around like data privacy, to your point, James, information security, ESG. I almost completely forgot where I was going with that. too many buzzwords there in some respect to think about there. But we might just want to get those off there, and that's a really easy way to do it. And you can do that, and you can obviously use that data in your form building, which we'll try and cover in the next session for sure.
Yeah, there'll definitely be more to talk about with custom tabs in future, for sure.
That's great. And James, just I'm just going to linger on the question. I don't believe we can move the tabs around in a different order at present. It kind of just goes in a chronological order as to where we make the tabs in the vendor or contract record, right?
Or
Or can we
reorder them? So
awesome.
I've got three,
but we
I've
can't
got 3 here.
we can't do it with the core tabs, right? They stay as is, and then just on the far end we can move those. I didn't actually know this on this point, so I'm glad I've just learned something as well.
No, it's a good clarification. You can't move the core tabs around, but in a vendor record, I could, if I wanted finance data to be more important than InfoSec, I can put that at the top and it will appear further to the left when someone's viewing a vendor record.
Yeah. No, that's great. Awesome. Megan, I will get someone to reach out to you about your request there. We can definitely sort you out there. It's I'm glad to hear that what you're seeing sounds useful and that you want to try it out for sure. Awesome. Do we have any other questions, Lucy? I think I'm scanning.
That is everything.
That's great. Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool.
But if anyone has any other questions post-webinar, feel free to reach out to us or your CSM, and we will get the recordings, the touch list links, and anything else, knowledge base articles, etc., over to everybody, likely by next week. So thank you, James. Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you both, and thanks everyone for tuning in and listening to us nerd out again, as always. That's, especially James and I. Lucy, thanks for reeling us back in, because we go down some rabbit holes sometimes.
We'll see everybody hopefully back next month for the continuation of our control series.
Excellent.
Bye, everyone.
Awesome. Bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.